Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series examining the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode number 26 for Sunday the 11th of March 2018, and today's episode is 1993's Tombstone, starring Kurt Russell as Wyatt Earp, Val Kylmer as Doc Holliday, and covering events in Tombstone, Arizona between roughly 1879 to 1882, including the famous gunfight at the OK Corral. My name is Martin Darlington, and with me as ever is Andrew Blischek.
Hello. Due to the likely length of this episode, we'll try and keep the intro short today, but here is some listener feedback. Brian Willits has posted on his Facebook page,
on our Facebook page,
facebook.com/History by Hollywood, all one word, a link to a documentary about the aerial filming for the movie Dunkirk. Although, as Brian laments, there's nothing about the extended gliding that we saw on the Fortress 1 in that movie. More feedback from Abel AK, who hosts the Tale of Rome podcast that we told you about last time, when we wrote about, in episode 25, The Founder. He replies, "I have to say, your research on the movies you tackle is world class. Never thought I would listen for over an hour to an episode of a movie I never saw about a fast food chain I never visit. Great work."
Thanks, Abel.
Thanks very much, Abel.
That's
well put.
That's very pithy.
Yeah.
We've also had an email from Andrea Braid, and it's short and to the point. Andrea says, "Beyond the Sea is the real story of singer Bobby Darin." I like your podcast, by the way. Regards, Andrea. Thank you very much, Andrea. It's added to the long list. It's not something I was really aware of.
I knew of it, but I didn't think about it for the pod.
Yeah,
we'll put it on the list.
Kevin Spacey project,
yeah,
isn't
his
it?
pet project.
And supposedly he looks a bit like Bobby Darin, and he sounds quite a bit like
he did
Bobby
all the
Darin.
singing for the movie, I know that.
Yep, on the long list. On reviews, we're still working on a global check for new reviews. So if you have written one in the last year and it hasn't been acknowledged, just drop us a line at hosts@historybyhollywood.com, or you can tweet us at historybyhwood, or there's the Facebook page, which we just mentioned, the facebook.com/historybyhollywood. This is Martin in post-production editing, just saying, don't worry about us searching for reviews. We've got some very good news. Rob Irwin, who is both a listener and has been a supporter with a wealth of good information and advice, largely due to his being the host of, or he being the host of the Doctor Who podcast. Very successful venture, very good podcast. So if you are a fan of the Time Lord, give Rob Irwin's podcast a listen. But after we complained about the difficulties of finding reviews in other countries, Rob sent us a link to a fantastic service called mypodcastreviews.com. There's a free monthly check of all Apple and Stitcher sites in over 150 countries for a single podcast. If you do run more than one podcast, or you want a more frequent update, there is a modest fee. I think the next level does 2 podcasts and they check weekly, and that's $55 for a year. So, it's not too bad at all. It's less than $5 a month. But thank you very much indeed to Rob, and anybody who does produce a podcast and you're like us, you're struggling to find the reviews, then mypodcastreview.com. Can't recommend it enough. It's already working for us, and to that end we have discovered some reviews we've missed. Now, a couple of them are quite long, so we are going to break them up between this and the next episode, which will be for Zodiac. But I will just pile in, because poor old Doug Moore, who's an old friend of mine, he was a Motopod listener, a MotoGPOD before that, on the 5th of November last year, he wrote that he followed me across from Motopod. Doug is an ex-US Navy helicopter crewman, door gunner, rescue diver. So he and I have other things in interest rather than just motorcycle racing and history. But he said he's always loved watching a movie and really concentrating on it. His father brought him up on the old History Channel when they actually showed history, and not people just picking up scrap Harleys and doing them up or whatever. So following to this podcast was quite a natural choice for him. He, like all things, there was a bit of a change. He was used to my voice. He took a little while to dial into Andrew. But he did say what he likes now is Andrew's learnt when to interrupt Martin's steamroll, which is probably, a very nice way of putting it. And and he quite enjoys the counterpoint between the two of us, which is great news. But he really loves the content. Glad that we're exploring subjects beyond World War II. There's so many, great history shows and movies and documentaries and podcasts focusing on that incredibly significant war, as Doug puts it. But he really likes the fact we're doing sword and sandals, science, music, World War II sport, space, technology, culture. His degree is in East Asian Studies. So along with years of martial arts experience and obviously a love of flying, he's in AMT school now after the Navy. I'm not quite sure what AMT school is. I should have looked that up. Doug, drop us a line. Hosts at historybyhollywood.com. But he's suggesting The Last Emperor, which I've never actually seen. I've been told it's a little bit of a drag to watch it, but it is definitely one is on the list. Ip Man, I'd never heard of. Looked it up. It's about the introduction of Chinese martial arts to the wider world. Fearless, yeah, definitely. Black Hawk Down, definitely. The Aviator about Howard Hughes, definitely. And a movie called Besouro, a Brazilian movie, which I don't know. I'll have to research. And he also suggests that Jules's music, the intro music, should be called The Waltz of Anachronism. I think it's a great title. Unfortunately, it's not actually a waltz, because that's 3 beats to the bar and this is 4. But, and he says, keep up the great work. Thank you ever so much, Doug. I'm now going to return to Tombstone and jump out, but we will be catching up with a number of other Pad Been Missed, a couple from last year, including one from our very own composer and my dear friend Jules Chusek, aka Pop Monkey. So here we go, back to whatever I was saying before I jumped in. So, on with the movie.
First of all, the story of the movie. Tombstone is a 1993 Western, written by the original director, Kevin Jarre, who was replaced with another director, George Cosmatos. Jarre had already had a relatively successful screenwriting career, which included being the screenwriter for a previous History by Hollywood movie, Glory. Unfortunately, while he may have been a great screenplay writer, he proved a hopeless director and was fired by the producers only a couple of days into filming. Kurt Russell stepped up into the director's role until Cosmatos arrived, and according to many industry sources, Russell continued to pull the strings behind the scenes for the remainder of the movie. Cosmatos was already a successful European and British director before a recent move to Hollywood, where he made some okay movies, but it seems Tombstone is his most critical success.
Yeah, the movie stars a strong, mainly male ensemble cast, including Kurt Russell, Val Kylmer, Sam Elliott, Bill Paxton, and their narrator at the beginning and end of the movie is Robert Mitchum. And of course we also have the legendary Charlton Heston appearing in it.
Yeah, he does at the end.
The action takes place between 1879 and 1882 in the Arizona town of Tombstone and portrays the rivalry between famous Western outlaws and lawmen. Lots of classic characters and events from the Wild West, including Wyatt, Earp, Doc Holliday, and the gunfight at the OK Corral.
The director and the crew apparently went to great lengths to get things historically correct, as well as trying to get the costumes, buildings and props as close to a 1879 Arizona setting. All the mustaches, of which there are many, are real, and Val Kylmer apparently spent many hours practicing his quick draw.
Val Kylmer does seem to be, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Heat with Robert De Niro and Al Pacino. Robert De Niro plays a robbery gang, armed robbers. Val Kilmer's one of his team, and their technical advisor on the making of the film was Andy McNabb, former SAS soldier who wrote a book about his experiences in the Gulf War.
Okay.
And he said he'd never seen anything like it, the dedication of Val Kylmer on a range, firing a weapon, and he'd just stay there for hours and hours and hours, and getting their pepper potting, we call it in the army, where one of you covers, the other one moves, then he starts putting fire down and you move. And he said their professionalism was astounding, but Val Kylmer for him stood out, so it doesn't surprise me.
There you go.
As mentioned at the end of the last pod, Tombstone was a critical and financial success. It cost $25 million to make and took over $56 million at the box office, and that's just US domestic box office. It runs for almost 1.5 hours, although the version I watched, which is available on Amazon Video, a little plug there for Amazon, is 2 hours and 4 minutes long. It was almost entirely filmed on site in Arizona.
So now on with the comparison.
Yeah. First of all, a little bit of the sources. The movie says it's at pains to be historically accurate, but that's fine if you use as your primary historical source a book written by a chap called Stuart Lake in 1931, and it became an absolute storming bestseller. Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal. But
unfortunately,
the effect it had is it skewed the lens forever. We always look at Wyatt Earp through a prism created by Stuart Lake. Now, he was Teddy Roosevelt's press secretary, and he heard about Wyatt Earp from Bat Masterson, who we'll mention later, and interviewed Wyatt. They interacted for the last few months of Wyatt's life at the end of the 20s, where he was in Hollywood trying to get a movie written about his life.
And he befriended some famous Hollywood cowboy actors like Tom Mix, amongst others.
Yeah, some of them were pallbearers at his funeral.
Yeah.
And obviously they'd have been fascinated because they're portraying something that he actually lived through. We'll go on about the creating of the legend, but basically Stuart Lake wasn't the most objective.
No, he inserted a lot of words into Wyatt Earp's mouth apparently, and took liberties with the action and the protagonists.
Well, we'll cover the opening scene, which is a voiceover and the movie's way of setting the scene, and then we'll set the scene ourselves and introduce the characters as they really were.
Yeah. Okay.
So the opening scenes, it's 1879, and Robert Mitchum's voiceover tells us that after the Civil War, the migration west surged with all types of people joining the drive for new land. Cowmen turned towns into armed camps with a high murder rate, and into this chaos comes, quote, legendary lawman Wyatt Earp, who was handing in his badge and is settling down for a peaceful life with his family. I'd just like to interject that if you're going to want a peaceful life for your family, why would you choose a
Wild West town
an edge of the frontier, Badlands, mining boomtown? Anyway, back to the narration. We're told that Wyatt's friend John Doc Holliday has joined him heading for Tombstone, hoping the dry air in Arizona will help his tuberculosis. The narrator also tells us that 100 Texan outlaws have got together to form a ruthless gang identified by their red sashes and called the Cowboys.
Okay. So, we know it's 1879, and what's going on? What's the environment that they're trying to depict there? Wyatt Earp had in fact been a constable. He'd been a lawman in Missouri in 1870, but he'd been accused of collecting licence fees and skimming some money off, and then he was accused of horse stealing. He escaped.
He was arrested and escaped from prison.
He went to Illinois, where he was arrested more than once, I think, for running a brothel.
Yeah.
He then served as a peace officer, whatever that means, some sort of a lawman in Wichita, Kansas, from 1875 to 76. But he got into a fight with a former marshal and was arrested, fined, and fired. He then became a deputy in Dodge City, 1876 to 77, where he worked under Bat Masterson, another famous or infamous gunfighting lawman who we'll return to later. Wyatt then turns up as an assistant marshal in 1878 to 79.
Yeah, that's back in Dodge.
Yeah. During his time in Dodge, he confronted an armed man in a saloon.
There was a group of arms, about 5 of them, I think.
They jumped him and left him. He was heavily outnumbered. Doc Holliday, who at that stage was just sort of a passing acquaintance, intervened, and literally, Wyatt says, saved his life at that moment, and they became lifelong friends. Well, I don't know about lifelong friends. They became close friends after that.
Yeah. After the latest stint in Dodge, Wyatt arrived in Tombstone. Now, the brothers, there's only 3 portrayed in the movie, Virgil, the eldest, then Wyatt, and Morgan. There are actually 2 other brothers, both of whom were involved at different times. In fact, there were 3 other brothers in total.
6, yeah.
But Virgil Earp was the eldest brother. Wyatt and Morgan was also Warren Earp, and he joined Wyatt in Tombstone after the attack on Virgil, we'll get to later on.
There was another one, James.
There was Newton, the eldest of the 5 brothers. He lived in California, in San Bernardino, which we, of course, spoke about in The Founder, where the first McDonald's was, where he ran a saloon, not a McDonald's. And James Earp was a half-brother to the others. He was born to their father's second wife, and he was in Tombstone during the period, but he wasn't directly involved. Doc Holliday was called Doc because he'd been a dentist, but he qualified as a dentist, and before he started actually practicing was diagnosed with TB. And his long-time partner, Kate, was actually called Big Nose Kate. Apparently she was a very loud prostitute who was quite happy to indulge in some violence. She didn't probably quite look as alluring as the part played in the movie by Joanna Pacula.
The bad guys, the cowboys, didn't exist quite as organised as weren't quite as an organised gang as the movie suggests. They were a mix of small-time ranchers who would steal cattle, often from across the Mexican border, and some proper outlaws who had found Texas too hot to handle with the rise of the equally legendary Texas Rangers. So apart from the threat to each other's financial ambitions, there was also political conflict in between the cowboys, who were primarily Democrat/Confederacy-leaning supporters versus the Earps, who were staunch Northernist Republicans/Unionists coming from further north Illinois. So that's quite a scene setting. So, yeah.
So the movie continues with its scene settings, and we see a large group of riders all wearing these red sashes, which incidentally is fictional. That's a device by the movie, so we know who's a cowboy and who isn't. There's a large group of these cowboys riding and then we cut to a village where there's some Mexicans attending a wedding, and the cowboys ride in. There's a big confrontation. The Mexicans are told that they killed 2 cowboys, and it's not that clear at the time, but it actually turns out they're Mexican armed police.
Right.
And one of their captain is
the one that they target.
Yeah. There's a close range gunfight. Most of the Mexicans are dead or wounded. However, the bride, the groom, and the priest survive unscathed until the Cowboys' leader, we meet Curly Bill Brocious, played by Powers Booth, tells the captain to kneel. When he doesn't, he's shot in the knee, and obviously collapses to his knees. We also meet Johnny Ringo, played by Michael Bean. He shoots dead the priest who's haranguing them, and it's quickly established that these cowboys are bad news.
Okay, so did any of that happen?
It may have done, we don't know.
In bits and pieces.
Yeah.
But clearly it's a plot device to establish who the bad guys are very quickly, and to let us know that they are indeed very, very bad.
Yeah.
And maybe a bit mad, Ringo particularly.
Yeah, borderline psychopathic, and, he understands the priest. He's multilingual. The priest quotes a passage from the Bible about the horseman of the apocalypse or something, and he says, he was getting on my nerves. He got a quote wrong, so he shot him.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay. And we also meet Ike Clanton, who looks like a Clampett from the Beverly Hillbillies. He's got one of those hats with the front brim turned up, big beard, missing tooth. He looks a bit of a hillbilly.
Yep.
But we will come back to Ike Clanton again and again.
Yeah. So back in the movie, we're now at the Tombstone railway station, and for the first time we see Wyatt Earp, played by Kurt Russell, with his luxurious and droopy moustache. His first act is to hit a man who is whipping his horse as he's trying to get it off the train. Wyatt is then approached by a man who introduces himself as a US Marshal. Wyatt immediately cuts him short and says he doesn't want a lawman's job anymore because he's retired. Then we also meet Virgil and Morgan Earp, played by Sam Elliott and Bill Paxman respectively. The wives of the 3 men are also there, and so we're introduced, and they are all introduced to each other, including Wyatt's wife Mattie, played by Dana Willen Nicholson.
Yeah, the truth of that is the Earp brothers actually arrived together along with their wives, including James, who would play little or no part in the subsequent dramas. I think James actually had an arm injury. I think he was either one-armed or he only had the use of one arm. Okay. Far from Wyatt being approached to join the law enforcement authorities, it was actually Virgil who had already been appointed Deputy US Marshal for Pinto County, a district around Tombstone. Yeah. So we can bear that in mind when later in the movie we see Virgil agonising over whether he should become a lawman. Yeah. Well, he already was, in truth.
So we next meet in the movie Doc Holliday, coughing and sweating as he's playing cards. He's joined by Kate, as we say, played by Joanna Pacula, who pours him a drink as Doc wins a $500 round of poker, I think. His opponent leaps up and tells Doc to take his money and get out. Doc shows off his quick draw skills but lays his pistol down, at which the man attacks him. But Doc has a knife, which he produces, a small knife, and ends up in the man's side. Next, we see Kate and Doc riding off with the casino's winnings, with their own winnings as well as all the casino's takings.
Yeah, they basically rob the casino and then say, I think this town is, we're done with this town, love.
Yeah. Again...
Yeah, the specifics of the scene are there to illustrate Doc's life before the move to Tombstone. He was a friend of Wyatt's, as we mentioned already, but he had few other friends due to his caustic nature and wandering habits. But he did have an on-off relationship with Big Nose Kate for much of his adult life, but he was a professional gambler.
Yeah.
He did a bit of dentistry on the side. He had worn a badge a couple of times when he'd been deputised, but only on a temporary basis, I think. But he was described by Bat Masterson as a weakling who wouldn't have been able to beat a healthy 15-year-old boy in a fist fight.
Yeah. Well,
as a result of which, he practiced and became incredibly good with guns and knives.
Right.
Because he had an argumentative nature. So I think what he's saying is...
He couldn't use his
fists. He
fists.
thought, rather than try and suppress my argumentative nature, I'll allow it, but I better get good at fighting, because if I use my fists, I'm going to get beaten up a lot.
So the scene is fictional, but tells a reasonably close story to the truth of what Doc Holliday may well have been like.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to the movie. We see the Earps arriving in Tombstone, clearly a new and growing small town. They're in a wagon with all their possessions piled on board. Wyatt is met by the town sheriff, John Behan, played by John Tenney, who's clearly heard of Wyatt Earp. Behan, a little bit of a dandy, a little bit of bowler hat, tells the Earps that he's also the tax collector and on the land commission, and he can sort them out some rent them some houses.
Yeah, John Behan was a real person, and he was, as we'll discover through the movie, a friend to the so-called cowboys, which they often allowed him to be re-elected as sheriff, because the cowboys would get cats, dogs, horses to vote, underage children, dead people. It was all very rigged. He was said to be a dandy, and a lot of the population was just like, well, he's just an apologist for the cowboys, But
he would have collected the taxes, and he was entitled to keep a proportion, like 10% or something.
The Roman tax farmers.
Yeah, and that's also something that Wyatt Earp had also done in a previous lawman's job. He'd been the tax collector and proved quite lucrative.
Which is one of the reasons that a lot of people became very keen to become town constable or sheriff. Yeah.
Back to the movie.
Next, we meet Town Marshal Fred White, played by Harry Carey Jr., who had been a prolific Western actor in the 50s and 60s, the John Ford movies and the like.
Ah, okay. I didn't know.
Which was a nice little tip to that. But he's an old man, whereas in reality, I think Fred White was about 31. He tells the brothers, this is Marshal Fred White, he tells the brothers that being isn't really the law around here, that's the cowboys. He said they run every saloon and bar in town except the Oriental, which we hear is a slaughterhouse. He said, good people, it's really nice in there, but no decent people go in there because it's just rowdy. Yeah, so Wyatt goes straight in to see what's what. The barman, he chats to the barman, he says, the problem is that the card dealer's a hard man and he just scares people away. Truth of that, before we move into the scene, is the brothers Earp did buy a quarter share in the Oriental, and Wyatt would often be the dealer at the faro or poker tables. I'm not familiar with the game Faro, F-A-R-O, but it was Doc Holliday's preferred game, apparently.
And he often played security, just like the film suggests. He was the tough muscle around the Orient to keep everything under control. So
I
got that right,
Yeah.
Okay, back to the movie. We've got this belligerent guy at the table, at the gambling table. The dealer. And Wyatt challenges him. And the man mocks him because Wyatt isn't carrying a gun, so he's got nothing to be afraid of. Wyatt then challenges the dealer to shoot him.
We've got a clip now where you're going to hear probably one of the naffest lines in the film, followed by one of the coolest lines. But anyway, we'll hear that now.
Something on your mind?
Just want to let you know you're sitting in my chair.
Is that a fact?
Yeah, that's a fact.
Well, for a man that don't go heeled, you run your mouth kind of reckless, don't you?
No need to go heel to get the bulge on a tub like you.
Is that a fact?
That's a fact.
Well, I'm real scared.
Damn right you're scared. I can see that in your eyes. Go ahead, skin it. Skin that smoke wagon and see what happens.
Listen, mister, I'm getting awful tired of your...
I'm getting tired of your gas. Now jerk that pistol and go to work. I said throw down, boy. You gonna do something or just stand there and bleed?
So go on, skin that smoke wagon and see what happens. Just
Translate, please, Martin.
Made me wince. I think skin that smoke wagon is pull your gun and fire it.
Right.
However, are you going to do something or just stand there and bleed? But we'll go on with this bit of the movie. So basically, Wyatt throws the dealer out, strikes a deal with Bill, the bar owner, doesn't he?
Yeah, and the dealer, just to side, is a fairly young Billy Bob Thornton plays the dealer. He's a bit disguised behind his beard.
I saw he was in the cast and I was thinking, where's Billy Bob turn up?
He's hiding behind a beard, but it's him.
I like Billy Bob Thornton.
Yeah.
He's slightly weird, but he's a good actor. Back in the street with the brothers, Wyatt doesn't see the bleeding dealer coming after him with a shotgun. He's still bleeding from the lip. But Doc Holliday does and sort of steps out and intervenes, and he just talks to the man and he says, "I'm sorry, John, I forgot you were there. You may go now." So anyway, they shake hands. Doc greets the brothers. They're clearly all old friends. And
the dealer realises
he was about to shoot Wyatt Earp.
Yeah.
He's like, he's Wyatt Earp.
And
Further confirming the fact that, this is the legendary Dodge City lawman. As the Earps and Doc are stood there, we hear gunfire and some men burst out of a saloon and one of them shot dead, and then, everything calms down and the marshal and the sheriff arrive, but these two guys are going, no, it's fair fight, they drew first, and
self-defense.
And then they look around and go, Wyatt? And this is Turkey Creek Jack Johnson and Texas Jack Vermillion, whose actual name was John Vermillion, they think. A couple of rough-looking characters, but they obviously know Wyatt, and there's smiles and handshakes. And then we see a stagecoach arrive, delivering a young lady, Josephine Marcus, also sometimes known as Sadie Marcus, just not in the film, played by Dana Delaney, accompanied by a somewhat camp young man, Mr. Fabian, who's played by Billy Zane, who appears to be a thespian, but Wyatt's attention is purely on the young lady.
Okay. Next, we see the theatre of Tombstone, which had a couple, and the cowboys are assembled in the stalls, and they're watching a show, while the Earps and their wives watch up above from a box. Then they're joined by Doc and his companion Kate. Mr. Fabian, Billy Zane's character, starts to perform Shakespeare, while the rowdy men in the audience fire their guns at the stage. The speech ends up going down quite well and is applauded as the guns are now fired into the ceiling, which you'd think would be quite a dangerous practice. So Wyatt gets to see Josephine again as she's part of the show, and Wyatt is clearly stricken. Maddie, Wyatt's wife, asks Wyatt to stay with him a while before he goes to work at the Oriental, and he shows concern at Maddie's increasing use of laudanum, which she laughs off. And at this stage, I think I googled laudanum. Shall we do a bit of a reality check on all of that?
Yeah. Going back to the scene where Wyatt goes in and confronts the dealer, there's no record that that's a strictly accurate scene, but it does illustrate how ready Wyatt Earp was to confront trouble or make it if he saw some benefit to it. However, or however much he was a willing participant in creating his own legendary status, every account I've read about him does say, certainly from friendly and from non-partisan sources, praise coolness, courage and restraint. Apparently he genuinely was
fearless.
He was very fearless. He was quite happy to face people down unarmed or without drawing his weapon, and the thing he used his pistol for most was to buffalo people, as they called it, which was pistol whip. And he'd rather do that than shoot them. However, his willingness to violently confront someone is less morally excusable in this case, because he was doing it to get a table to deal cards out and make money, rather than because a man's broken the law.
So Doc had arrived around the same time as the Earps, and what's frequently mentioned is that he wasn't an easy man to like, as we've already said. Bat Masterson, who had first-hand experience and appears later in the film, I think.
Yeah,
the character.
Sorry, I jumped ahead and read this bit out earlier, didn't I? Or mention this, that the fact that Doc Holliday was a weakling.
Yeah, 15. Yeah, he couldn't be the 15-year-old. Yeah,
but
you're right.
It's funny that Bat Masterson went on to say, whilst Doc possessed none of the qualities of leadership such as those that distinguish men such as H.P. Myton, don't know who that is, Wyatt Earp and Billy Timon, and other famous Western characters, he did seem absolutely unable to keep out of trouble for any length of time. He'd no sooner be out of one scrape before he's in another, but Marston said the strange part, he was more often in the wrong than in the wrong, which is rarely a case with a man who's continually getting himself into trouble. Masterson only really tolerated Doc because they had a mutual friendship with Wyatt.
There were at least two theatres operating in Tombstone at the time, and one of them, the Sheffield Theatre, named after the town's founder, which would show quite highbrow productions, and the Birdcage, that was more in line with how we'd imagine a frontier town's population's tastes, just like the one that was portrayed in the movie. And apparently the Birdcage Theatre still exists, and if you visit it, you'll see some bullet holes in the ceiling as shown in the movie.
There's about 100 bullet holes around the place, the walls and the ceiling.
Fantastic.
So they really were stupid enough to fire into a ceiling made of plaster which could then fall on them.
That's awesome.
Okay. Back to the movie, and at the Oriental, at the card playing table, Wyatt, as dealer, has accepted deeds to a silver mine in lieu of payment, and turns to his brother and said, "Right, we're in the mining business." Doc also mocks Wyatt for claiming to be a happily married man when he's so clearly smitten with Josephine, who, right on cue, arrives at the Oriental at that point. Sheriff Bean jumps in and offers Josephine a drink as Wyatt returns to his dealing table. And at this point, Mr. Fabian arrives and is applauded by the collected people as the man comes up and asks for Wyatt's autograph, further cementing his legendary status.
However, the autograph paper is ripped from his hands by cowboy bad guy Curly Bill, who swaggers in with his bad guy psychopathic mate Johnny Ringo, together with others from the cowboy group, including Ike Clanton, played by Stephen Lang, as who Martin already said, looks like something out of the Beverly Hillbillies. And he tells Wyatt that law don't hold around here. Johnny Ringo taunts Doc Holliday, calling him a lunger, and who taunts him right back.
Yeah, and they go into this
highbrow argument in Latin.
Yeah, we've got a little bit of clip of that, and then we'll go through what they say. And after the clip you hear, after this little to and fro in Latin, Johnny starts doing some very impressive revolver twirling.
Yep. And
it's quite a famous scene if you've seen the movie. Doc responds by the little tin cup he's been drinking whiskey out of. And he sort of
spins it on its handle.
Yeah,
in his
and he's clearly drunk.
It's a good scene.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Sheriff Bean... Oh, sorry, yeah.
Let's do the Latin clips.
Let's play the clip.
Johnny Ringo, the deadliest pistoleer since Wild Bill, they say. What do you think, darling? Should I hate him?
You don't even know him.
No, that's true, but... No, I'm sure of it. I hate him.
He's drunk.
In vino veritas.
Agic voragis.
Creda Judaea sotella non ego.
Eventus stultorum. Magister.
Pace requiescat.
Come on, boys. We don't want any trouble in here, not in any language.
Meanwhile, Josephine is staring at Wyatt, obviously mutually fascinated, and she asks Sheriff Bean, who's that? And his first response is, he's married. And she sort of laughs self-consciously as if to say, well, why would you feel the need to tell me that?
Okay, well, let's get some reality check, including Latin translations, underway. So we've got Dana Delaney's character, Josephine Marcus, who was also known as Sadie Marcus, and she's got this frisson with Wyatt Earp in the movie. After her arrival, she does fall in with John Bean.
In reality, they think she was she'd known him before, and he summoned her saying, look, if you come to Tombstone, I'll marry you.
Right.
So she turned up expecting marriage, at which point he sort of
retracted
or delayed, or
although they still were a thing, they still were a couple of some sort.
Yeah, some people say that involved a physical relation, some say it didn't. Sadie or Josephine had in her past worked as a prostitute, but seems to have left that behind at this stage of life and probably did want to settle down.
But at no stage was she on the stage as an actress, from what we know?
She did. I think she did some singing,
Right.
but
Okay.
not necessarily as a
Travelling performer.
No, and the Doc versus Ringo Latin banter. This is where Wyatt. Doc's first line is actually in response to Wyatt saying, because Johnny Ringo's looking a little bit, "Oh, you're winding me up." That's why Doc says, "I can't decide if I'm going to hate him or not."
Right.
He reminds me of me. No, I'm definitely going to hate him. Wyatt says he's drunk. Doc says in vino veritas, which a lot of people will be familiar with. It just means in wine there is truth, or when I'm drunk I speak the truth.
Ringo replies, "Age quod agis," which is, watch what you're doing. You're drunk. Sort of, you're drunk because you're a drunkard, and be careful what you do or say. So,
yeah.
So one says in wine is truth, and the other says, well, be careful what you say when you've got a loose tongue.
There's a forum I found with a guy who said he was a Latin professor, and he certainly seemed to know his origins. And he did say the pronunciation is not precise, but it probably was accurate for how people back then would have done it, especially Johnny Ringo, who hadn't had a formal education and was self-taught. So he'd have read these words and had to guess how to say them properly.
Right.
Then Doc comes back with credat Judaeus appella non ego, which the figurative translation is tell it to someone else, not I, a common Latin phrase, and it was let the Jew appella believe it, not I. It's dismissive and again insulting.
To which Ringo replies, Juventus stultorum magister. Youth is the teacher of fool. In other words, you're young and unaware of the dangers you're getting into. A warning reinforced by Johnny tapping his revolver.
Yeah, it's very well delivered that. He says, Juventus stultorum, there's a pause, his hand rests on the hilt of his revolver, and then he says, Magister. Magister. Yeah, and Doc replies, in pace requiescat, rest in peace, which has an obvious warning, but could also mean, be quiet.
Yeah,
just sit down and stop talking. Okay, so back to the movie, and I found this a slightly nonsensical scene.
It's Hollywood.
Wyatt, in his shirt sleeves, goes out riding, and on top of a mountain in the middle of nowhere, he just happens to bump into Josephine.
They go for a fast ride, hurtling across the prairie through trees, down a steep slope, and then end up having a picnic and verbally sparring about life, fun, risk, and whether the blonde woman Josephine saw Wyatt with was his wife. Wyatt says his idea of heaven is family, steady life. She laughs at him and says for her, it's room service.
So very quickly, reality, we don't know how they met, but they did meet, and in a small town like Tombstone, they'd have certainly been aware of each other. It's unclear when the relationship began, but it did at some stage, given that they spent the last 47 years of Wyatt's life together. So I think they clearly liked each other.
Yeah, they don't really address the fact that he's a supposedly married man at this time.
Well, he was a common law wife. Mattie, his wife, again, a former prostitute. And it's worth pointing out, I mean, I read a book by Sean McLachlan, who's a Western historian, about this whole period, and he said it would not have carried the stigma for either the lady or for the husband. There was a distinct shortage of women on the frontiers, and those that were there were either married, generally, or were prostitutes or businesswomen,
right?
Who were very few and far between in those very patriarchal days. But there was no stigma attached, because a woman had to keep the wolf from the door and bread on the table, and just as men would work for the law or against the law and steal.
As the circumstances suited them.
Yeah, so the women had to do the same. So, we shouldn't think, oh my goodness, he married an ex-prostitute, which today would seem, quite scandalous, but then not at all.
It was just life. Yeah. Okay, so back to the movie. We're in Tombstone, and now Wyatt finds Mattie off her head with laudanum, and laudanum is a solution, and it contains opium, and it was prescribed for all sorts of things in its day, particularly for women with menstrual cramps. It's very common for them to take laudanum and to overtake it, to get addicted to it. Back at the Oriental, Doc is playing the piano while members of a cowboy gang, particularly Billy Clanton, try to wind him up with insults and comments. We cut to a tent where Curly Bill is clearly off his head on some kind of substance, possibly opium as well, but definitely something hallucinatory. Bill starts firing off his pistols, breaking windows and endangering the townsfolk. Back in Wyatt's saloon, Sheriff Behan tells Marshal Fred White he needs to do something about it. The ruckus outside with Curly Bill, as this is his town, and it's his business to look after it.
Yeah, this was Sheriff Bean says Curly Bill's
In
going
Tombstone.
off, and Wyatt says, "You're the sheriff," and he goes, "No, I'm the county sheriff. This is town business. This is town marshal's job."
So the older guy,
So he tells Fred White to go out and sort it.
By now, Curly Bill is both howling and shooting at the moon. Old Fred approaches him, calling out to warn him. Aiming his own pistol at Bill, he demands that Bill hand over his guns. Bill says sure, but as he hands them over butt first to Bill, one of the revolvers fires and hits Fred. I got that wrong. Yeah. I got that right. Wyatt then arrives. He sees that the lawman's been killed. He assumes Curly Bill did it out of malice, and so he pistol whips Curly Bill unconscious, just as Ike Clanton and all the other cowboys arrive, telling him to turn Bill loose. Wyatt holds his gun to Ike's head and says that Ike will die first. Ike panicked and he tells the cowboys to back off.
Yeah, and we got a little clip here, and there's another good line about that Wyatt Earp comes out with, so that you'll hear it's Ike Clanton saying, "Lord Og, we're going to tear you apart if you don't turn him loose," and then you hear the comeback. So let's just play that clip.
I swear to God, Lord Og, you don't step aside, we'll tear you apart.
You die first, get it? Your friends might get me in a rush, but not before I make your head into a canoe. You understand me?
He's bluffing. Let's rush him. No. He ain't bluffing.
You're not as stupid as you look, Ike.
And you, music lover, you're next.
Drunk piano player. You're so drunk you can't hit nothing. In fact, you're probably seeing double.
I have 2 guns, one for each of you.
Okay, back in the movie, we see the Earps playing pool in a bar, and Wyatt is telling his brothers that Judge Spicer has acquitted Curly Bill from the last scene, as there were no witnesses, and so it could well have been an accident, and no one could prove he intended to shoot Fred White. The Mayor John Clum, arrives and again seeks to recruit Wyatt or Virgil to join the law enforcement agencies, but they both refuse. He lays a guilt trip on them about all the trouble that they could avoid if they were stood up for the town, but he then leaves. Virgil appears troubled, and he goes out into the street and he sees a group of cowboy riders coming through firing guns in the air. He has to actually grab a small boy and scoop him out of the way of the riders, and you can see that now he's conflicted about whether he really should become a lawman. So next scene, we see Virgil, who in fact wearing a badge, nailing up a notice saying it's now forbidden to carry a gun within the town limits. Wyatt starts to argue with Virgil and is told that Virgil can't make money out of the town without taking steps to civilise the place. Then Morgan reveals that he's also wearing a badge. Wyatt makes one last effort to stop them from going down this lawman path. He says that all the time he was working law enforcement in all these cow towns, he only ever got in one gunfight, but a man lost his life and Wyatt took it. He knows that Morgan doesn't want to know what that feels like.
Yeah, so the truth of that, John Clum really did become the mayor of Tombstone during this period, on and off, and he was also the editor of the Tombstone Epitaph. This was the newspaper that had Republican Unionist leanings and therefore was a good friend and defender of the Earps. The Democrat Confederate leaning paper was the hilariously named Tombstone Nugget. The whole series of scenes where Virgil struggles with his conscience and Wyatt argues that they don't need the hassle that being joining the law enforcement will entail is fiction, because Virgil has been a law enforcement officer since they arrived.
Yeah.
They've both been law officers in the past, Virgil and Wyatt, and in reality, Virgil became a federal deputy marshal almost immediately they arrived. Wyatt was deputised at times, but it was Virgil who held the more permanent posts.
Okay, back to the movie?
Yeah, in the Oriental, Doc and Kate are playing cards with Morgan Earp and Ike Clanton and another cowboy. And I'm just going to throw a little bit of reality in there, which we don't actually have in the notes, that lots of the accounts say they'd have these set-offs, the cowboys and the Earps, sometimes even fist fights or, facing each other down with guns. But in the evening, they'd still sit down and play cards with each other.
Okay.
So it's very strange. Anyway, it's very weird. Playing cards in the Oriental.
Doc is seen winning a large stake, and Ike starts to accuse him of cheating. but he backs off when Virgil intervenes. A fight nearly starts but eventually calms down. The cowboys are leaving the Oriental. They retrieve their guns from the bar as Doc starts coughing blood and then collapses. Carried to the hotel by Morgan and Wyatt, Ike continues shooting off his mouth, unaware that Virgil is behind him. Virgil knocks him out and drags him to jail. The next morning, 2 other cowboys come to fetch the hungover Ike, and more words are exchanged. Ike warns the Earps that they've got a fight coming and coming today.
Yeah, I mean, the reality of Ike Clanton seems to be portrayed pretty well in the movie. He was said to be a loudmouth and make all kinds of threats when he was backed up by his brothers and their friends, but on his own would suddenly find his courage ebbing away.
We've already seen it twice, haven't we?
Yeah, and it's a recurring theme. The Clantons and the McLowrys were the 2 prominent families in the cowboy organisation, both small-time ranchers.
Okay, so we've got, back to the movie, we've got Doc in bed with a doctor telling him that he thinks Doc has probably lost 60% of his lungs. A group of riders arrive in town, 6 cowboys, as a wagon moves past bearing a banner, equal pay for equal work, regardless of sex.
Yeah, I found that slightly obscure.
Incongruous.
Yeah, it was just strange. It's just a background thing. There's this wagon going past with all these ladies sat on it with these banners saying, equal pay for equal work.
Maybe it was.
Yeah, fair enough.
Maybe it was something for the 1993 audiences. Maybe it was a political fight going on at that time.
In Hollywood, I don't know.
Yeah, Wyatt then tells Virgil that he'd better swear him in, and he has a badge. And so Wyatt, despite his protestations, has a badge once again because of all the trouble that's coming. Mayor Clum arrives to warn the brothers that the cowboys are telling everyone that they're here to clean out the Earps. Clum adds that they're behind the OK Corral. Doc arrives, limping but upright, but Wyatt says they should wait until the cowboys' liquor wears off. However, Virgil says he won't tolerate law-breaking. So they're walking down the street now, going towards the OK Corral. They're approaching the stables where the cowboys are hanging out. People are watching on. Sheriff Beam tries to persuade the Earps and Doc that he's already disarmed the cowboys, but they carry on regardless.
Yeah, they come around the corner and Virgil has got a walking stick, and he's given his shotgun to Doc, and he's got a walking stick in his right hand or a cane, so to sort of, I suppose, try and defuse any potential armed standoff. And he says to the men they're here to disarm them, and there is a bit of a standoff. One cowboy, a guy called Billy Claiborne, turns, we don't ever really hear his name in the movie, he turns and runs away. And they're staring at each other, and Doc winks at Billy Clanton, whose face changes. You can see this is the young protagonist who'd been winding him up at the piano the other night, and we hear Wyatt go, "Oh no," and then all the guns start blazing. And quite cleverly, it's not clear who draws and fires first. Several cowboys are downed. Ike Clanton throws his hands in the air screaming, "I got no gun," runs up to Wyatt and sort of grabs his legs, and Wyatt
Please
says,
for mercy.
"Yeah, get out of here, just get clear." He runs into a building. This is Ike Clanton. Virgil and Morgan are both wounded, but Billy Clanton has been shot several times and is down and looks like he's dying. Seeing this from inside a building, Ike grabs someone else's gun and shoots at the Earps, but Doc pours shots into the building, a bit like the Spitfire ammunition there. They're 6 shooters, but single action pistol apparently they only ever have 5 rounds in it.
Right.
So anyway, the final cowboy left outside is shot dead. Sheriff Bean arrives and says, "You're all under arrest." And Wyatt says, "No, I don't think you're going to be arresting me today." Then the wives arrive, but we have Josephine running towards Wyatt from one side and Mattie from the other, and she sees the looks exchanged, Wyatt and Josephine, and she's sort of, she's horrified and thinks, "Oh." Doc and Wyatt stroll off, and that evening a funeral procession of the dead cowboys in hearses goes through the town with a banner proclaiming "murdered."
Okay, so we've had the
gunfight
at the OK
Corral, yeah.
How did they do?
Pretty well. John Clum, the mayor, did warn them, so did other business owners, other citizens throughout that day, saying, "Look, there's some cowboys here, they're saying they're going to finish you off, they're armed, they're carrying their weapons." A newly arrived chap who was didn't know any of these people. He was an engineer, I think. He just arrived on a train, but as he was walking towards the town centre, he heard this group of men saying, "Yeah, we're going to do the Earps, and yeah, we're going to shoot them down." And he asked someone, they said, "Who are the Earps?" But no, they're quite an important family here. They're in law enforcement. So he goes to them and warns them, and even then, they didn't really seem to take him that seriously. It's like, oh, it's Ike Clanton gobbing off.
Yeah, okay.
They didn't seem that bothered.
And it didn't actually occur in the OK Corral, did it? It occurred
it was
out in the
a
street.
vacant lot around the corner, or in the street. But as someone pointed out, gunfight at a vacant lot near the end of Fremont Street doesn't quite have the same ring as
gunfight at the OK Corral. The movie does show the lack of clarity. The history says we're not really sure who fired first and what happened, and there's a general feeling of chaos and bullets flying everywhere from everyone in the movie. So they kind of got the feel of the place right, but the real, everyone says, but both sides of the argument, that it took about 30 seconds, and that's all it was. And I did a quick timing while this was on, and this movie goes for almost exactly a minute.
Right.
So the movie's twice as long as the actual, but I guess that's Hollywood.
Yeah.
Bit more firepower than there'd be.
Ike Clanton didn't grab a gun and start firing at him. He just ran and kept running. He actually he got quite a distance apparently before he collapsed or hid. The eyewitnesses, there were eyewitnesses, plenty of them, and their testimony seems to be split depending on their sympathies between those who felt the Earps and Doc Holliday made every effort to peacefully disarm the group of cowboys who'd been making public threats, and those who said no, they basically went down there and just killed them all. Well, they didn't kill them all, but the fact that Wyatt didn't shoot Ike when he ran towards him would rather support his claim that they only fired when they felt they had no choice. And the Clantons' testimony said the first person to fire was Doc Holliday. Now I'm guessing they thought, knowing his reputation, people would believe that. But they said he'd emptied his revolver at Billy Clanton, or it might have been Will McLaury first, but he was carrying a shotgun.
Yeah.
So he'd have had to drop the shotgun, draw his revolver, and then
continue shooting.
And yet the shotgun had both rounds discharged, so that doesn't stack up.
Yeah, just confusion.
Yeah, Billy Clanton survived for a short while, long enough to proclaim he'd been murdered. And it also turns out Ike Clanton, who's quite the key figure in this, actually made a deal with Wyatt Earp back in March 1881, because this is now in October 81, the gunfight at the OK Corral. 26th of October 1881, if anyone wants to observe the centenaries or the anniversaries. But he made a deal to provide names of some cowboys who'd robbed a stagecoach. And his deal was that Wyatt, he'd give the names to Wyatt, he'd arrest them, he'd get the credit for it and then become town sheriff or county sheriff and be able to collect all the taxes and skim his money off. And in return, he'd give the reward money to Ike. And Ike had got very nervous about this time. He was convinced that Wyatt had told people about this deal, which obviously would have had him a marked man and a traitor to his family and the cowboys. And he was convinced that Wyatt had told Doc Holliday. So Wyatt said, well, go and ask him. So they go and ask Doc Holliday, and Ike says, did you tell him about the deal me and him had? He said, well, no, he didn't tell me, but I obviously know now. So, yeah, I don't think Ike Clanton was very bright.
Is that it for the reality check on the OK gunfight?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so back in the movie, we see a drunken Johnny Ringo tell the Earps that he wants their blood and their souls, and he wants them right now. Wyatt is unarmed, and he walks away as Ringo screams that he wants blood.
And then this is the first time we hear this rather classic Val Kylmer's Doc Holliday line.
Wretched slugs. Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
All right, Lunger. You go to hell. I'll put you out of your misery.
Say wham! Johnny, go!
So we see this confrontation between Holliday and Ringo and the I'm your huckleberry thing, and Curly Bill restraining Ringo. It would sort of imply that he thinks Doc Holliday is going to be a quicker
target
or a quicker fighter, a quicker gunfighter than Ringo. In truth, neither Ringo nor Curly Bill were in town at the gunfight at the OK Corral, but it didn't provide any kind of resolution. It just raised tensions.
And what about that expression, I'm your huckleberry? Do we need to explain that?
Yeah, it just apparently means I'm the man for the job.
Yeah, I've never heard it before.
Man. No.
I'm your man, yeah, I'm the guy you want.
Yeah, and a couple of times he said, as a threat, if you do, you're a daisy, which apparently is a reference to pushing up daisies.
Oh, right.
You'll be feeding the daisies, or you'll be a daisy. There's another of Doc's comments.
Yeah. Okay, so back in the movie, it's now night, and Sheriff Bean confronts Josephine and says he knows she's got feelings for Wyatt. But after tonight, there'll only be one person in charge of Tombstone. It's quite an ominous threat. At the Earp's place, Virgil leaves to walk home. He's watched by dark figures in the shadows. A thunderstorm is raging as the wives are surprised by Josephine warning them that something may happen tonight, as a man pushes through the door and fires a shotgun through without hitting anybody. Back at the Oriental, Virgil arrives, stumbling and wounded. They get him to their home, and a doc treats him as Morgan storms out. Wyatt follows to see 3 cowboys, McMasters, Jack Turkey Creek Johnson, and Texas Jack Reed, or maybe his name was John Vermillion, who throw their red sashes down and tell Wyatt that they're with him if he needs them.
Yeah, basically they're saying, that's it, we've had enough now
Yeah.
Of working with the Cowboys. In reality, the Wyatts were warned by many and various citizens about the Cowboys making threats. The inclusion of Josephine, aka Sadie, doesn't appear to be true, but by this time I think she'd pretty much realised that John Bean was too leaky a vessel to put much hope in as far as marrying her, and she might well have switched fire to Wyatt.
Around about now.
Yeah, Virgil, he was ambushed.
Yeah, but wasn't it much later? This is suggested it's the same day, isn't it?
No, this is 3 months after the attack, after the gunfight. That was in October 81. This is December 81.
Yeah.
He was shot, and they thought he was going to die from his wounds. It rendered his left arm useless, would pretty much see him out of the remaining action in Tombstone. At one point, Wyatt, this is the reality, he wired the state marshal requesting authority to deputise others, and he said, his telegram reads, Virgil was attacked by concealed assassins last night. His wounds are fatal.
But they proved
so they
not to
did
be.
think that he was going to die. The next day, Wyatt was appointed Deputy US Marshal, a federal post. As far as Sherman McMasters, Jack Johnson, and Texas Jack Vermillion, McMasters knew Wyatt from previous towns. They had been associated with the Cowboys, but it wasn't a set organisation.
A gang as such.
It was just they were allies of convenience when it suited them. They were definitely on the wrong side of the law more than the right side. But McMaster's interesting. He'd been a Texas Ranger and had met Curly Bill Brocious down there, who was on the other side of the law, but they really got on. So which is probably why he ended up working with the Cowboys.
So it's not unusual that even Wyatt Earp himself is on both sides of the law during his history, and so for these Cowboys to flip-flop and go back to the right side of the tracks and support the lawman, but it's quite likely.
Certainly, there was an account written by Wells Fargo. They were the stagecoach and mail people, very influential, very powerful, and they had their own enforcement agents. And one of these guys knew Wyatt Earp very well. He said, he might have sometimes pushed the law, but he was always in the interest of the law. That's debatable, but he was obviously a bit of a fan. But he suggested that McMasters and the 2 Turkey Creek and Texas Jack had been feeding information to Wyatt and the Earp brothers from the Cowboys of what they were planning to do, stuff like that. So they did indeed join the Earp
at this
posse.
time. Back to the movie, we see Morgan playing pool, back at the Oriental or at a bar, not sure.
It seemed a bit weird after he sort of stormed out with Virgil wounded. And the next thing you see him playing
pool somewhere. When all of a sudden some shots ring out and he slumps to the floor. He's been hit in the back. Wyatt and the doctor do their best to remove the bullet, but the doctor says it's too deep. With a classic Hollywood last speech, Morgan says they got him good and Wyatt shouldn't let them get him, and we see Morgan die. A distraught Wyatt leaves the saloon and walks into the rain, which starts to wash Morgan's blood off his hands. Josephine runs to him and he roars that she should get away from him. So she does, as does Maddie, his common law wife.
Morgan was murdered pretty much as
in the
shown. He was playing pool. Wyatt was in there. A bullet hit the wall just above Wyatt's head, but if he was an intended target, the assassin missed.
Happened later.
It happened in March. Yes, this was 3 months after the attack on Virgil, and obviously the movie's compressed it, so it looks like the next scene. And back to the movie, we then see Curly Bill and Johnny Ringo sitting outside a bar or cafe or a house. On like a porch, as Wyatt and Virgil, with an arm and a sling, prepared to take Morgan's coffin for burial, and in another wagon are all their wives and possessions. It looks like they're leaving town. Stopping by the Cowboys, Wyatt says, I just want you to know it's over. And Curly Bill just says, bye. And as the Earps leave, Bill tells Ike, he says, take Stillwell and finish it.
So it's clearly not over.
Yeah.
And now we're at the railway station. Ike and Stillwell see the ladies and Virgil on the train and call out, "Where's Wyatt?" only to hear, "Right behind you." Wyatt shoots Stillwell dead, and Ike pulls his usual trick of throwing down his weapon and pleading for mercy. Cutting Ike with his spur as he grovels, Wyatt and his new posse, Doc, McMasters and the other 2 ex-cowboys, surround Ike. Wyatt shows Ike a badge that says US Marshal. He tells him that anyone wearing a red sash is a dead man. "Tell him I'm coming and hell's coming with me." Another great line.
Yeah, and here's Kurt Russell saying it.
Hey, Matty, where's Wyatt? Right behind you, Stillwell.
All right, Clanton.
Wyatt, please don't kill me, please. Please.
Take a good look at him, Ike, because that's how you're gonna end up.
The Cowboys are finished, you understand me? I see a red sash, I kill a man wearing it. So run, you cur.
Run! Tell all the other curs the law's coming! You tell them I'm coming! And hell's coming with me, you hear?
So the reality on this bit, they did decide that Virgil, for his recuperation, needs to go to California. Morgan's body actually left a day or two earlier, I think. James Earp, unseen in the movie, escorted Morgan's body to the family home in California. And a couple of days later, Wyatt with McMasters, Doc Holliday, Turkey Creek Johnson escorted Virgil and Ali Earp to Benson. They were going to catch a train to California as well. There they heard that Ike Clanton and Frank Stillwell were hunting for Virgil, so Wyatt and his team escorted them all the way through to Tucson, Arizona. Now the state capital, I believe. Or was that Phoenix?
I don't know.
I don't know. Tucson's a name I know anyway. Now all we know is when the train left, shots were heard. And Frank Stillwell's body was found with several holes in it, dead. Those are the only known facts. Wyatt later said he saw Clanton and Stillwell lying on a flatbed carriage, aiming shotguns at the well-lit train carriage where Virgil was, so he challenged them, upon which they ran away and he gave chase. Stillwell either stumbled or fell, but Wyatt was able to catch him. In his own testimony, he said Stillwell trembled, was unable to draw his gun, or didn't tried to grab Wyatt's shotgun, sort of beg him for his life, at which point I gave him both barrels. So Frank Stillwell is very dead.
Yeah.
No attempt to arrest him, but then you think, well, what would you arrest him for?
Yeah.
He's armed in a town where everyone else is armed, watching a train. Needless to say, the other version is that the Earp posse hunted down Clanton and Stillwell and killed Stillwell dead. The Tucson sheriff issued warrants for the arrest of Wyatt and his posse, and that was telegraphed back to Tombstone, but the telegraph office manager was a friend of Wyatt's. They got back and he said, look, I've had this telegram, but I'll delay giving it to Sheriff Behan. When he gave that to the sheriff the next morning, the Earp posse were getting ready to ride out, so they're heavily armed, all tooled up with rations and food and like, going out to their horses. Behan says to Earp, I want to see you. And supposedly, and this has been reported by several sources, Wyatt replied, if you're not careful, Johnny, you'll see me once too often. And they left unhindered.
The great line, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we've had the key scene where Wyatt Earp sort of turns from not wanting to get in a fight, sick of being a lawman, to being a deputised and
Deputy
now
Marshal,
deputy
yeah.
marshal, and taking revenge for the death of his brother. And as you've said, there are two ways to look at it. He's either seeking justice where justice needs to be sought, or he's become a cold-blooded killer and premeditated murderer.
I mean, Wyatt claimed later that Judge Stillwell, no relation of Frank Stillwell, who's just been killed, said to him, look, you keep bringing these guys in under arrest. This was Wyatt's justification for it. And the juries are crooked, or there's not enough evidence, or the witnesses are intimidated, and I have to keep releasing them. Or, giving them a fine for a misdemeanor, not putting them away or hanging them for a felony. He said, you need to, what did he say? You need to administer justice out in the bush, where people don't come back and complain or something like that. So basically, he felt Judge Stillwell had said, go on, just go and kill them all.
Yeah, okay.
So back to the movie, and we see a series of scenes showing a 5-man posse in ambushes and raids, shooting down cowboy after cowboy. Some of the shootings do seem more like cold-blooded murder. There's also some hangings. And then we get a fight by a river where you get the impression that Wyatt's posse, small posse, have been ambushed, and Curly Bill's there, pinned down. They're looking like they're cornered, and Wyatt just loads up a shotgun and starts shouting, "No, no!" and walks out into the open, wades into the stream.
Yeah,
and Curly Bill's sort of looking at him like he's mad.
Easy target now. Take him down with
that. They're all firing their weapons at him, and nothing hits him. And Wyatt shoots Curly Bill dead, and then kills more people with his revolver. He shoots Curly Bill with a shotgun.
Okay, so we've had the posse, the infamous posse, and the vengeance. What's it called? The
Vendetta Ride.
Vendetta
the Earp's
Ride.
Vendetta Ride. It's become known as, and the posse was a bit larger than depicted in the movie. Their justification, the justice system was letting them down, took law into their own hands. There was also actually a counter posse raised by Sheriff Bean, which we'll see a little bit later in later scenes. Trying to chase the Earps with considerably larger, but this was Sheriff Bean who deputised a number of cowboys, including Johnny Ringo. The encounter with Curly Bill happened at a place called Iron Springs. Now, some people say the Earps were ambushed, other people say no, neither side expected to find the other there. But it's a watering hole, I suppose it would be a magnet for people out riding. Supposedly, but Wyatt dismounted after Bill shot him with a shotgun, some pellets hitting the tails of his coat. He returned fire, killing Bill, supposedly cutting him in half virtually, and he fatally wounded another cowboy called Johnny Barnes. Then Wyatt tried to mount his horse, because the rest of his posse had turned and legged it,
right,
except for Vermilion Jack, who was pinned under his horse that had been killed in the early shooting. Wyatt tried to mount his horse, but his gun belt was slipped around his thighs and was acting like a hobble, and he couldn't get his legs far enough apart to straddle the horse, so he sort of lay across its back. The heel of his boot was hit by a bullet. I mean, the rest of his companions couldn't believe he was alive.
Yeah.
He did seem to live a charmed life.
Yeah, and the scene where he's wading into the river and all the bullets are missing him, it's kind of the reputation he ended up having at the end of his life, wasn't he?
Bulletproof.
He didn't sustain a bullet injury during his entire interesting life.
Gunfight at OK Corral, he was the only person, him and Ike Clanton and Billy Claiborne, who ran away. He was the only person who fired who didn't come out with anything.
Yeah.
Doc and Virgil were lightly wounded. He did rescue Texas Jack from under his own horse, and then they got away. Like I say, some people say the cowboys ambushed them, others say both sides were surprised. So we had 2 dead cowboys. In reality, at this stage, that's all. So all these other clips we've seen of them hanging people,
the montage,
is nonsense.
Yeah, the Vendetta Ride was to try and get these 2 guys, wasn't it?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
They did it. So back in the movie, in the aftermath, Wyatt is down by the creek in contemplation as Doc, McMasters and the other companions clean their weapons. McMasters says he reckons Ringo will be headed straight for him. Doc starts coughing, and so they ask him what he's doing and when he's so clearly ill. Wyatt is my friend, he replies. McMasters' buddy says, I've got a lot of friends, to which Doc replies, I don't.
Yeah, the next scene shows us Johnny Ringo and Ike Clanton leading a large group of cowboys riding cross country, and this is the Bean posse, because Sheriff Bean's with them as well. Yeah. They intercept a stagecoach, and Josephine's in it with Mr. Fabian, who's clearly dead, the actor. Sheriff Bean, sorry, that's my phone going off. Sheriff Bean is with the gang, and Josephine says to him very angrily, your friends did this, he was a beautiful man. And Ike says, it must have been 2 of our gang who ran off the night before. They'd attempted a robbery, they'd tried to steal her watch, I think, and shot Mr. Fabian. And there's a bookish cowboy who's meant to be Billy Breckenridge. He seems to serve no purpose in the movie, really. Anyway, he mounts his horse and rides off, saying, we've got to have some kind of law here.
Next we see Wyatt and his posse see Ringo in the distance with his much larger group, the other posse. Doc is getting worse, so they ride to Henry Hooker's ranch, Hooker played by Charlton Heston, who agrees to look after Doc, if only for a night. Josephine's coach is there, and she and Wyatt share a moment together before she climbs aboard and leaves. She does have the decency to shed a tear.
Yeah. The truth about these bits, the creekside conversation with Doc probably didn't happen because they were riding away, but does illustrate this thing that Matt Marston mentioned. He wasn't a popular man, so he needed to. His friendship with Wyatt remained solid for many years. So maybe because he didn't have many friends, he thought, the few I have, I better stick with.
The death of Billy Zane's character, Mr. Fabian,
Yeah,
that's obviously fictitious.
so,
He
yeah.
didn't exist.
The bookish cowboy cast as Billy Breckenridge. He did indeed walk away from the Cowboys and actually became a law enforcement officer, but he was a big man who wasn't scared of a fight, so I'm not quite sure they portrayed him as a
wimp.
a clerk or something.
Yeah.
Sorry, anyone who's a clerk. And Henry Hooker's Ranch, we'll come back to that in a bit, but Henry Hooker's Ranch did exist.
And they did have them for one night, I
And
think.
Charlton Heston's probably old enough to have actually been working there.
Could have been. Okay, back in the movie, we see a rider approaching Hooker's Ranch, dragging a body behind his horse. The body turns to be that of McMaster's. The rider shouts out to Wyatt that Ringo wants a one-on-one fight with him and tells him where to meet. Wyatt roars, "I'll be there." We see Ringo tell Ike Clanton that after he's done with Wyatt to take the Cowboys and burn the rest of them. Wyatt, we see, is with Doc, who is now bedridden, as they discuss Johnny Ringo and his motivation. Doc says he needs revenge for being born. Wyatt knows that he can't beat Ringo and is clearly worried, but he's also determined. Doc tries to rise to go with Wyatt, but he collapses back into bed, coughing and apologising.
Yeah, in reality, this is where the movie really does depart from the historical record and even Wyatt Earp's own account. Sherman McMaster's was some of the... Will McLaury, one of the Cowboys, wrote in a letter to his dad, "Yeah, we killed Sherman McMaster's." Wyatt Earp said he died fighting as a mercenary soldier in the Philippines in 1898, and yet the McMaster's siblings said no, he died in Colorado in 1892. So Sherman McMaster's didn't get dragged behind a horse and dumped, and the whole Wyatt versus Johnny Ringo duel is hoopla. And during the Vendetta ride, at some stage, Johnny Ringo gave himself up to a semi-friendly sheriff and was put in jail. Supposedly for his own protection. He said, "If they catch me, I'm dead."
Okay.
So he was actually nowhere near any of this.
Okay.
So we go back to the movie, and Charlton Heston's Henry Hooker sees Wyatt offer the handshake, and he rides off with the two remaining ex-Cowboys. They wait at the appointed spot, and three Cowboys ride up and tell Wyatt where to find Johnny Ringo. He tells his companions, he says, "Look, they're giving you no safe conduct, so as soon as you hear the shooting, get away and head east," because he's obviously worried. We then see Ringo waiting, and he sees a long-coated man approach wearing a badge with his head down, and he says, "Wow, I didn't think you had it in you." But as it turns out, it's not Wyatt Earp.
Well, I didn't think you had it in you.
I'm your huckleberry.
Why, Johnny Ringo, you look like somebody just walked over your grave.
Fight's not with you, Holliday.
I beg to differ, sir. We started a game we never got to finish. Play for blood, remember?
I was just fooling about.
I wasn't.
All right, Lunger. Let's do it. Say when.
Poor soul. He was just too high-strung.
Ringo and Doc start to circle each other, only a few feet apart. Doc is smoking with one hand, and as they stop moving, he says, "Say when." They draw, and Doc shoots him in the head before Ringo can get a shot away. Despite the headshot from a few feet away, Ringo keeps his feet for a short while, staggering around before finally collapsing.
As stated above, the Ringo duel with Doc is fiction. However, there are some details that the movie makers have got right. A few months later, in July 1882, Johnny Ringo's body was found lying at the foot of a large tree with a single bullet wound to the temple. The coroner's report cited the cause of death as suicide, and he had supposedly had fits of depression at times. Wyatt Earp later, on one occasion, claimed to have returned to Arizona and shot Ringo. On another occasion, he said he went back with Doc Holliday, and Doc had shot Ringo with a rifle from distance. The truth will never be known, but you can forgive the movie makers departing, because we get to hear Val Kilmer's Doc Holliday saying, "I'm your huckleberry," one more time. And Ringo did manage to keep his feet an awfully long time with a bullet in his brain.
Okay, so back in the movie, we see Wyatt arriving and realising that he's not going to die today at Ringo's hands. Looks at Doc and says, "All right, let's finish it." And we see more scenes of cowboys being shot down. In one scene, Wyatt hangs over the neck of his horse Sioux style. What's the other? Arapaho Sioux style.
Yeah, I think the Arapahos were quite famous, and the Cheyenne
Horsemen.
for the plains horsemen.
Right, okay.
And they'd hook a leg over the neck of the horse, hang below its chest, lean forward under its neck, and fire arrows incredibly accurately. Yeah.
Yeah, so in other words, he's hidden behind his horse from the cowboys that are trying to shoot him. Without even looking or aiming, Wyatt reaches under the horse's head and fires his revolver, killing the other man. Right.
Yeah. And the final scene of these fights show Ike Clanton and John Behan racing away, being chased by Wyatt and his team. Ike removes his red sash and drops it, and yet again Wyatt lets him go, because I think he just feels sorry for him because he's a Beverly Hillbilly.
Yeah.
The reality that there are cases of incredibly gifted shots with bow, arrow or firearms shooting from horseback, but for the vast majority of even experienced riders and gunfighters, it would have been less hit and miss and more miss and miss. A short barrel weapon is not accurate at any range, and you try hanging under a horse
and shooting a man with one shot.
You're trying to. It's suppressive fire. You're trying to put the other guy off his aim. I find that hard to believe. So I think this is Tombstone's equivalent to Fortis 1 in Dunkirk, firing 75 seconds worth of ammunition whilst gliding for several hours. I'm not going to let that one go.
We're back.
The Earp posse did stay over at Hemi Hooker's ranch, and from there they left for Arizona for good, because they had multiple arrest warrants against them because they'd basically been going around murdering people, despite their status as federal deputy marshals. The vendetta ride started after the Tucson killing of Frank Stilwell, and it took the lives we've seen Curly Bill and the other chap who died there. And they also took the life of Florentino Cruz, who was a Mexican member of the Cowboys. Wyatt claimed to have killed him in a fair duel. He said, no, I let him keep his gun and said, well, let's do this fair. And I killed him. But he had multiple bullet wounds, so that seems rather unlikely. From Hemi Hooker's ranch, the Earps and most of their team left Arizona, heading to New Mexico territory and never going back unless you believe the Earp Holliday claims
going
back to kill Johnny Ring.
So, despite all the montages of cowboys being gunned down, there were three.
Stilwell, and then 3 during the so-called vendetta ride.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so back to the movie. We're now at the Glenwood Sanatorium in Colorado, where Doc is being led the last rites. When Wyatt arrives, Doc is clearly weak and has his feet uncovered. Wyatt deals him some cards, but Doc doesn't want to play. They speak about a few things, and Doc tells Wyatt to chase his showgirl. Then Doc asks Wyatt to leave, as he doesn't want his friend to see him dying. Wyatt has brought him a gift, and it appears to be a short book or pamphlet entitled My Friend Doc Holliday by Wyatt Earp. Doc smiles, looks down at his feet, and says, "Now that is funny," and dies.
Yeah, Doc did die in Glenwood, but Wyatt never visited him. They at some stage after leaving Arizona, they had a fallout. No one knows what the cause of the argument was, but they basically parted ways. And Wyatt didn't hear till some years after Doc's death that he had actually succumbed to TB. However, the people caring for Doc at the end did report that he looked at his uncovered feet, said, "Damn, that is funny," and then died. And everyone's assumed that it's because he always expected to die with his boots on.
I read something in the research about the falling out between Doc and Wyatt. Josephine was Jewish and an observant Jewish lady, and Wyatt was being fairly respectful to her ways, recognising the Friday traditions or something. And Doc Holliday did at one stage accuse, more than once maybe, Wyatt of becoming a good little Jew boy. So,
yeah,
that could have been
He was from Georgia, wasn't he? So he might have been an unreconstructed racist.
Yeah.
You don't know. Yeah, certainly possible. In the movie, we see a proper brick house somewhere that's snowing, and Josie or Josephine or Sadie's in a makeup room having just finished a show when Wyatt walks in and says, "Have you ever seen the sunrise over the Rockies?" He tells her that Wyatt has nothing left to give her, or he tells her that he has nothing left to give her, no pride, no dignity, not even any money, but he promises to love her for the rest of her life. They kiss and run out into the snow together. And
in reality,
they spent the rest of their lives together.
Yeah, I don't think they ever married. This was another common law marriage, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so back to the movie, and we're wrapping things up now because we hear the narrator, Robert Mitchum, tell us that the Cowboys were broken forever. Ike Clanton was shot and killed 2 years later during an attempted robbery. Matty Earp died of a drug overdose shortly after leaving Tombstone. Virgil moved to California, where despite only having the use of one arm, became a town sheriff. Wyatt and Josephine set off on a series of adventures. They never left each other's sides until Wyatt's death in 1829 in Los Angeles.
1929.
In Los Angeles. Amongst the pallbearers at his funeral were some of the Hollywood Western stars.
Right.
And movie ends.
So, wrap up. Ike Clanton was killed 2 years later, but he was rustling cattle. Well, I suppose that's a form of robbery. Big Nose Kate, Doc Holliday's companion and the loudmouth prostitute, outlived everybody. Carried on being a prostitute. Then she ran a respectable boarding house and then retired to the Arizona Pioneers Home and died there peacefully in 1940.
Wow. That's incredible.
That's like going back to Zulu, where we had the colour sergeant who was only in his early 20s. He died in 1945. He did even better.
Well, even Wyatt Earp had a reasonable lifespan too. He died in 1929.
Yeah. So that's 70 in his 70s.
Yes.
The fortunes of Tombstone, they were already dwindling at the time of the Earp versus cowboy battles. These boom towns lasted about as long as it takes to say boom. You know, they'd rise and then somewhere else.
Typically chasing
mining,
gold or silver. Yeah.
Support from both sides of different parts of the population to each side. There were as many law-abiding citizens who saw the Earp's holidays just as culpable as the sheriff being in cowboy side. They just feel like they're two sides of the same coin. Largely, the split was along political divisions. Later in life, just to go back when we did the intro about Wyatt, basically everywhere he went, he'd end up being accused of something.
And have to skip town.
And have to skip.
If not escape jail.
Later, he and a couple of his brothers, or a brother and another friend, I think, were fined. They were trying to sell a German investor a rock painted with gold paint, telling him it was a gold nugget for several $1,000s. He always seemed to want to be a businessman and seems to have been very keen on public recognition. So I'm sure he'd be happy with how well known he is these days.
Yeah, that's true. But him and Josephine, they went to town after town after town, following the mining booms.
Yeah. They end up in Alaska.
At one stage, and they're very, wandered wide and far, seeking this, very nomadic lifestyle. Never settled anywhere until they finally get to LA.
No children.
I've
got a long bit here about Bat Masterson. Bat Masterson was, in many ways, if you read the history, should have been better known than Wyatt Earp. He certainly had a longer period of being a law enforcement officer with more run-ins, and was another tough man, big 6 foot imposing guy. He ended up being a sports journalist for the New York Times when he hung up his holster.
There you go.
And he met Teddy Roosevelt, who was president, and Teddy Roosevelt's press secretary, Stuart Lake. And apparently Teddy Roosevelt, who was fascinated by all this, he was a northeast, rich boy, and he saw himself as a frontiersman and a cowboy, and he learned how to shoot and ride horses.
Very attracted to Roosevelt then.
Oh yeah, Roosevelt was saying to Bat Masterson, look, you need to write your history, and Bat supposedly said, no, you can't write a history of the Wild West without Wyatt Earp's input, and he won't talk about it. I'm thinking, what do you mean he won't talk about it? He's in Hollywood desperately trying to get a movie made.
About his life.
And someone said, no, you need to get a book done, then they make the movie of the book. And the first book apparently was dreadful because the guy who wrote it with him was just not a good author. It was turgid and no one would take it up.
And so Stuart Lake steps up.
Stuart Lake, who was a very accomplished writer. I've not read the actual book because it was basically, it's the book of the film. Or the film is the film of the book. But Wyatt definitely put a lot of spin on a lot of the events. And then after Wyatt's death, Sadie looked over Stuart Lake's shoulder and demanded that he change this and change that to make Wyatt the hero. A lot of stuff that supposedly is told in the book that Wyatt did was actually Virgil or someone completely different.
But I think you've already said that it really was Stuart Lake who gave us the most common view of legendary lawman Wyatt Earp.
Just a quick
80 years ago.
Bat Masterson, he'd been an army scout and a buffalo hunter, and he'd been one of the 20-odd hunters cornered at Adobe Walls by several hundred, possibly over 1,000 Comanche and Kiowa warriors. They were led by a Comanche chief called Quanah Parker. He became famous because his mother had been kidnapped. It was a white woman, Cynthia Ann Parker, I think. She'd been kidnapped as a child, grew up with the Comanches, married a chief, and gave birth to Quanah. And when she was eventually found and brought back to Western civilization, she absolutely hated it, kept trying to run away. But yeah, so Bat Marston survived that. He knew Wild Bill Hickok and Buffalo Bill Cody, and he became a journalist, but he never wrote about his own experiences.
Maddie, the Wyatt's common law wife, she took her name, the Earp, out of respectability, remained a laudanum addict, and after Wyatt left her, returned to her previous life as a prostitute in Pinal, another Arizona mining town where she killed herself in 1888. Her story has tarnished Wyatt's reputation ever since. Some historians claim that Wyatt gained most fame during his lifetime for refereeing a fixed boxing match. This was some time after the Tombstone affairs, but the OK Corral gunfight seems to have quickly entered Western law, Wild West law and culture.
Yeah, I think what really the movie gets lots of little details right. We were saying off air earlier about the tin cup.
Yeah.
As opposed to glasses. It was far more practical, a tin cup. Especially if you're travelling from town to town. You put a glass in your saddlebag on your horse, it's going to get broken. So there's lots of little details, but I think where they really go wrong is they suggest that Wyatt Earp was legendary before he arrived in Tombstone. Some people would have known his name, but most of the accounts I've read and the historical articles in the book I read...
He did a good job as a Kansas lawman and made the papers a lot. But he wouldn't have been known presumably would have been known in Arizona. Not before the gunfight.
Oh my goodness, you're Wyatt Earp.
Yeah, turning pale and dropping your gun because of Wyatt Earp's name.
No.
But, what about overall? Entertaining?
Yeah.
I thought it was very entertaining.
It's a good film.
Yeah, I think Val Kylmer steals the film with a couple of winning lines.
Yeah.
And Kurt Russell does a really good job, and
Sam Elliott's always watchable.
Sam Elliott as Virgil, really
it's good. Cast, strong cast. Powers Booth as well as Curly Bill. It's got that real swagger.
Yeah.
And the Michael Biehn as the Johnny Ringo character. Yeah. No, I'd comfortably give it 8. I think, for entertainment.
I'd give it 8. What about history? It actually, look, in some respects, it's not bad. It's got the gunfight scene is pretty close, and all of the characters I think are actual real people. More or less, there might be one or two syntheses.
A compressed time, but lots of movies do that. Hidden Figures did that.
Yeah.
To a greater degree. We don't give halves, do we? I'm not sure if I can go to a 7, but because the tone is the overriding impression you get of Wyatt Earp is inaccurate. I feel.
Yeah, he's too perfect, isn't he?
And too legendary when the start of the film, where actually the legend really was created after his death.
And as you've already mentioned, he was famous across America a few years later, but that's because he apparently was fixed a boxing match and caused scandal across the country.
Yeah, so that's where he made national press.
That's right. But then something happened. The book's published. It takes off in public imagination in Depression
and
America.
And there's been, 7, 8 films about him now? At least. Big films. There must be more as well.
So it's accurate to that picture portrayed in the 1931 book, but it does take some liberties with Virgil being the real lawman, in the town of Tombstone. I don't know. What do we give it? 6?
You give it 6. I'll give it 7.
Go. And there's our half.
Or I'll give it 6. You give it 7.
Yeah.
So average out at 13 out of 20. Yeah. Okay, folks. We are going to wrap up there, and we're going to be back hopefully in 2 weeks' time. Now, there might be a week's delay because I need to go home for the same reason I was at home for 2 months earlier this year. So this goes out on Sunday the 11th, so the next one after that should be Sunday the 25th. But whether it's the 25th or the 1st of April, it's going to be Zodiac.
1993? No, this is 93. Yeah, it's later than that. It's later. Whatever.
We'll do that in
the serial killer.
It's about a series of unsolved serial killings in the late 60s in
California.
And it's got a great cast.
Yeah.
And that is something that we will look at in a couple of weeks.
Yes. See you then.
Cheers, everyone.